Welcome to the 11th and final episode of our podcast, Off the Record.
Welcome from my side as well. Eray, last episode?
Yes, let's discuss that later. We started our podcast exactly 11 episodes ago, which was also an experiment for us. And that's fitting, because that's exactly what we want to talk about today. The joy of experimentation. And today's guest on this topic is Barbara Büchli, Head of Business Excellence at Siemens SI Switzerland. A very warm welcome. It's great to have you here.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Barbara, what does business excellence mean? What exactly is your job?
That's actually not so easy to answer because it's an incredibly broad and diverse field of activity. I think you can basically say that our job is to make our business processes as efficient as possible. And that applies to both the process landscape and the tool landscape. Assessing the tool landscape, evaluating the skills of our employees, including those in HQs and local IT, is crucial. We must ensure we have the right skills among our workforce. Sounds complex.
It is, but it's also very exciting. We did a bit of research, Googled a bit about you and found the following quote from you. Make a difference in someone or something every day. What can you tell us about that?
The quote comes from an interview I was allowed to give when I became Alumni of the Month for the CAS I did last year. Great CAS, I'm not going to advertise here. However, it was an inquiry regarding the objectives I had established for the business, specifically business milestones, for the upcoming year after year after year after year. And I thought a bit about what those milestones would be and actually realized that what's more important to me than big milestones like tool rollouts is actually being able to make a difference every day. Yes, being able to make a difference every day. And I am convinced that we can all make a big difference every day and have a positive impact on the lives of others. Whether that's putting a smile on someone's face with a compliment, for example, or really giving someone confidence in what they do, or to be able to make a big career decision, for example.
It also fits in very well with today's theme of experimentation. What does experimentation mean to you?
That's a very good question. I actually thought about the question a bit and did a bit of research. I actually looked up two meanings for experimentation in the dictionary. So one meaning is actually an experiment is an attempt or a venture, a daring, uncertain undertaking. And it's also probably what we now want a little less of in a business context. And the second meaning of experiment is really a scientific experiment, where the aim is to discover, demonstrate, or confirm something. And of course, we definitely want to have this type of experiment in the business environment because our market and customer needs, but also the technological possibilities, are developing at breakneck speed. And innovation only happens when we experiment, namely when we have to break away from our usual way of doing things to some extent, because otherwise nothing new can be created.
As you said, this is a characteristic that is particularly important in the rapidly developing areas such as technology and science that we are living in. On a scale of 1 to 10, how keen are you to experiment?
It really depends on the area, but I would say that the average across the board is probably between 6 and 7 or so. While considering, I find myself eager to explore and innovate, striving to venture into uncharted territories. At the same time, I am constantly pushing myself to step out of my comfort zone even now. That continues to be an important aspect of my life. I am not just saying that something is cool, I genuinely have a strong desire to try out an experiment. However, trying new things always requires a substantial amount of effort.
We know it well, yes. For us too, it was a real break out of our comfort zone. We feel comfortable now, but as I said, even after 11 episodes, we're still nervous when it starts. Barbara, can you give us an example of how an experiment in your field, in the area of business excellence, has led to success or a significant improvement?
There are actually quite many things I could list, but I think it's more important for me to mention at this point that experimentation, or the joy of experimentation, is pretty much at the heart of what we do every day, because I said at the beginning that our sweet spot are the processes, the tools, the way people work, and to always be looking for ways to improve them, to think about how we can implement them, to keep testing new things. I think that shows a lot of willingness to experiment. And then something else I would like to mention is that my team is also very much involved in one of the biggest projects that Siemens has ever done, namely the SherpaX project. In a matter of months or years, we shall witness the outcome and evaluate the consequences.
How do you promote your environment? On the one hand, you said that your job brings that with it. These are also your activities, your daily business. There too, driving innovation, that's one thing, and the other is the same. It also takes courage. How do you support your environment and your team, and how do you handle it with your colleagues when things don't go as planned?
Well, I think you just said that it takes a lot of courage to experiment, because many experiments fail again and again. It effectively takes courage to try something new and to take a chance. It's important to acknowledge that numerous things will inevitably fail. I believe to address this very openly with people, to take away this pressure that every undertaking, every attempt must always succeed. Must always succeed. I believe in addressing this very clearly. And then what I always try to do in discussions is to talk through options and alternatives together. What could happen if that happens? What could we do then? How could we react? And I think that also gives you a lot of security, that you then know that I have thought about how I could react, so I'm more likely to have the confidence to experiment.
At Siemens, we also want to promote the willingness to experiment. We want to encourage employees to test new ideas and to see possible mistakes as a learning opportunity. What is your view? Are we doing enough?
I'm not so sure. I think it depends a lot on the area. It also depends a lot on the team, on the manager. However, the prevailing thought or observation I have is that we encounter immense stress from our daily operations. Our focus remains heavily on data, with a constant drive for achieving targets on a monthly and quarterly basis. We have to deliver our figures. We are also very successful, but that always leaves us hungry for even better figures in the next month, the next quarter, and the next financial year. And I think that sometimes it's difficult to really create this space. When you try something new, you have to accept failure and not just continue with what you've done so far in the hope that it will always bring the desired results in the future. So I think we can do even more by creating more room for experimentation, both within ourselves and in our teams.
I believe that from a company perspective, we promote this and want to create a space for it. It is also up to us to help shape this. In other words, to really add the space and then also create it indirectly. I think that is very, very, very important. So I think a willingness to experiment. Time for the drinks break. Exactly. How do you convince us to come to the tasting? What tasty things have you brought us?
I brought a beer from Nicaragua, the Tonya. Yes, and I have to say that ordering the beer was actually an experiment in itself, because I wasn't so sure whether it would arrive on the site where I ordered it.
Cheers.
So, Eray, are we going to continue with the podcast?
I would say we'll discuss how the podcast actually continues after this last episode later, right? Let's do that. Yes, let's talk about success and failure. Experiments don't always bring the desired success, as you mentioned earlier. What was the most instructive failure, and what did you learn from it?
Yes, I think I have to be a bit careful what I say now, because that was actually at Siemens. It's always nice when you can say that you somehow made a mistake at another company and learned a lot. No, joking aside, I reckon that was my initial foray into a management position at Siemens. At that time, I assumed responsibility for a team that happened to be grappling with a challenging restructuring process. We were in the middle of a difficult reorganization. It was a bit chaotic at the beginning, and the biggest mistake I made then was to think that I had to solve all the problems myself. I had to take everything off everyone's hands. I have to make sure that everyone is happy again, that everyone knows everything and everyone can do everything. And I have to do everything immediately and solve it right away, no matter how important or unimportant it is at that moment. That is my job. And as you can imagine, I failed miserably at it. So of course it didn't work at all, except that I was then completely at the limit and the team was still complaining about problems. But of course it was extremely instructive at the time. So really to think clearly about what my issues actually are, what I really need to solve, and what are perhaps also things where I can say to people, listen, I'm trying to help you, but this is your issue to solve. Or it's an issue, but it's not that urgent. So prioritize a bit there too, and don't let yourself be overwhelmed. And the most important lesson is to get help. You don't have to do everything on your own.
What personally motivates you to keep trying out new things, and how do you inspire others to do the same?
I think I already have a relatively strong urge or desire. Desire is perhaps a little more positive, to be able to shape things and help define them. I think I'm also quite curious. I always want to know how things could be done differently. That's what drives me, to get involved in new topics and projects. Yes, how do I motivate others? My true passion lies in inspiring individuals to introspect and not merely get consumed in their daily activities. It's crucial to prioritize moments of contemplation and perpetually engage in reflective thinking. Is there an alternative approach we can consider for better results? In what ways could we approach this differently? Oh, indeed, why would I alter my behavior?
You've been at Siemens for a few years now. What has changed in recent years? What has changed the most in terms of experimentation in recent years? Is it just a trend?
I believe it's not merely a temporary pattern, rather significant transformations have occurred in recent years. Reflecting on my 15-year tenure at Siemens, the approach used to prioritize effectiveness over complexity was frequently adopted. What you knew worked, because everything else was expensive and you could fail. That has certainly changed, so I think we are more willing to experiment than we were 15 years ago. But I also believe that we could be even more willing to experiment.
I also believe that I joined Siemens for the first time, and the speed of change has generally increased extremely during this time. But I think what has really changed is this awareness that innovation is needed, and also the importance of this willingness to experiment, let's say, on the management agenda or in our strategic priorities that has already arrived.
And how do you see the role for the future development of Siemens? So experimentation.
The role of experimentation is only going to get bigger because with all the technological progress and change, we can't assume that there will be any kind of speed, but rather that we will become even faster, or perhaps certain fields will become even more disruptive. Therefore, innovation is actually becoming increasingly important. And I believe, as we discussed earlier, that innovation can only succeed if we experiment and learn from our failures.
Are there any specific areas or technologies in which you see particularly great opportunities?
It's a bit of a buzzword, of course, but AI nonetheless, I can see huge opportunities for us there, but could also entail significant shifts in the market or within companies, because I think it will affect the solutions that we can offer our customers, which could change significantly as a result, but also the personal way of working. That AI, for example, Copilot, can be changed relatively significantly, or tools, processes, and analysis options. I can also see a major influence here.
So I also see great opportunities, especially when it comes to AI. But I also have a lot of respect for it. And I think there are also many people who are afraid. What advice would you give to people who are very skeptical about the whole thing? They say, yes, we don't require it. Thus far, we've handled things fine without it.
It's always difficult to react because I think saying, yes, you don't get it, that's really not enough. So if someone is afraid of a topic, of a change before an experiment, then you always have to take it seriously. And I think the most important thing is to find out together where this fear comes from. I have some reservations about the potential impact of technology on my career. While I'm not necessarily afraid of it, I do anticipate having to make significant adjustments to my work processes in order to adapt to the new technology. Maybe my job will no longer exist. And I think the most important thing is to approach the person openly and explore this together. Where does this fear come from? And then also, I think it's important to ask, yes, what's the worst thing that could happen, or what could happen at all? What would be the worst thing that could happen? But maybe also, how could you react to such a change at that moment? In other words, actually give the other person a bit of strength to believe that you have everything you need to deal with the situation in the future.
And getting help, as you just said, is also
Exactly.
very, very important. It can sometimes be difficult. But especially when it can reach such proportions, for you personally, it is crucial to be open and seek assistance by directly reaching out to people when in need. Transparency is of utmost importance because the possibilities we have that, I as a digital professional quite often. Well, I believe we've reached the conclusion of our discussion. Thank you, Barbara, for being here and answering our questions, and it was really enjoyable. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So shall we tell everyone what's going to happen with the podcast? I've asked 3 times now.
Yes, I think we should talk about it now. We've already mentioned it a few times. The podcast was an experiment for us and also the ideal channel to discuss all the topics we've talked about in the last 11 episodes. In the last 11 episodes, we thoroughly discussed using a specific example, examining it in great detail. There we have the topic of strengths and weaknesses. It also has a lot to do with the comfort zone. Dashi, how does it feel to be out of your comfort zone?
Outside the comfort zone. Today, if I take the example of the podcast, I would definitely say it feels pleasant right now. But it was a journey. Yes, as you said, taking strengths and weaknesses out of the comfort zone. Keyword error culture, creativity. We experimented, tried out new things. We did a lot of things right, but we also made some mistakes and are prepared to learn from them. What would you do differently today?
I would do without the AI tool. We used the AI tool to translate the French and English episodes. And I'm still fascinated by the technical possibilities. But the human, the emotional, the spontaneous, even the humorous, that simply gets totally lost in the translations. And the effort involved was very, very massive. I'm very glad that we tried it out. You only really know what something is like if you try it out. But I would definitely do without it in future. I have a little surprise for you. Do you know what we would sound like in Sweden, Egypt, China, Turkey, Spain, Japan, Poland and India? Shall we listen to it?
Hej! Välkomna till dagens podcast of The Record. Trevligt att du lyssnar in igen.
مرحبا بكم في الحلقة الرابعة من بودكاست السجلات.
大家好，欢迎收听今天的记录播客。很高兴您能再次收听。
Off the Record podcastimizin 4. bölümüne hoş geldiniz.
Hola, bienvenidos al podcast Off the Record de hoy. Encantado de que nos escuchen de nuevo.
Podcasto Rekodo no 4回目のエピソードへようこそ.
Witamy w dzisiejszym odcinku naszego podcastu. Cieszymy się, że jesteś znów z nami i słuchasz.
Records के हमारे podcast के चौथे एपिसोड में आपका स्वागत है.
Brilliant. I didn't know I could speak so many languages, and I always wanted to be able to speak Swedish. Adaptability also means always speaking the right language. Fascinating in any case, such an AI tool. We also acquired new skills while producing the podcast, which brings us to the topic of growth mindset. At the beginning of the year, I would never have thought that I would one day be a podcast host.
Me neither. And lo and behold, you in particular have received so many compliments for your very pleasant podcast voice. That would simply have remained hidden.
Yes, good thing there are filters. Yes, and a podcast experiment is only possible if empowerment and a culture of trust are practiced. And as you said, or as we've just discussed, we have also learned a lot. A culture of trust is one thing, but also being allowed to make mistakes.
Now we're sitting here in our podcast studio where we created this new channel 6 months ago without knowing whether anyone would even listen to us. We now have an average of over 700 colleagues listening to us, which I think is something we can be proud of, and at a third-party cost of less than 100 francs per episode.
Bargain.
Bargain.
So tell me finally, what's next?
Well, drumroll. I think that I've said that word already a few times. We're going into the 2nd season next year, and we already have lots of topics and ideas to keep things exciting for us. And of course for you too. At this point, a big thank you to everyone who has listened and been part of this experiment. We would be delighted to have you on board again next year.
Dear listeners, a really big thank you from me as well. Thanks. It's great to have you with us. And we'll be in touch again soon to let you know exactly when and how we'll continue and what topics we'll be talking about.
See you soon. Bye. Bye together.